This morning's message centers on the subject of biblical stewardship, or more specifically, how we can become faithful stewards of God's grace. And as one who grew up in the Baptist church, I understand that for some, stewardship is a trigger word. And that word immediately causes one to shuffle in their seat and to shift the bulk of their weight so that their wallets or purses are pinned tightly to the pew that they're sitting in. And this involuntary defensive posture is often accompanied by a quiet wave of anxiety, assuming that the pastor is about to announce an expensive new ministry program or yet another facility problem that requires immediate attention. I remember a yearly event at my childhood church called Stewardship Sunday. Anybody remember Stewardship Sunday at their church? Well, that was the day that the preacher preached a message on tithing while carefully avoiding certain hymns, especially the one titled, "Jesus Paid It All." And then at the end of the sermon, the ushers would pass out pledge cards and asking members to commit to a specific dollar amount of tithes and offerings for the coming year. And then once those pledge cards were collected, the finance committee would huddle up sometime in the next few days and tally up all the commitments, and they would soon present the church with a proposed budget for the coming year. And more often than not, after setting the budget to match the pledges, a random percentage was added to each line item so that the committee could say that the new budget was based on faith. And once that new budget was approved, the committee's work was done for the year. Now understand that I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with any of that, but if the word stewardship has triggered such thoughts or memories in your mind, you can take a deep breath and relax, because that's not where we're headed today. In this season that we're in right now, our membership consists mainly of those living on a fixed income, in an era when the cost of living continues to rise to unprecedented levels. Know that our church experiences that same pressure. And as it currently stands, our year-to-date totals for tithe and offerings are $14,000 less than they were this time last year. Yet, by God's grace, we've been able to pay all our bills while continuing to support the Southern Baptist Cooperative programs, fund the food ministry, and bless other missionaries, causes, and other organizations that we've chosen to assist. And on top of that, we continue to see the Holy Spirit work as He moves hearts to meet benevolent needs that arise through designated gifts, people using their blessings to become a blessing to others. So at present, again, our bills are paid, and by God's grace, and we've been able to do what we need to do without the additional burden of a loan payment. However, I also need to acknowledge the elephant in the room. Along with a declining income, we have an aging facility with significant age-related issues that need attention. And so with that said, early next year, we probably need to begin some conversations concerning about what the next chapter of Ellenwood Oaks Community Church might look like. But here's the main point of today's message. None of what we've been able to accomplish came by way of fundraising events or by trying to squeeze more juice out of a tired lemon. Instead, these blessings came through a church with a rich history of practicing good and faithful management of whatever resources God chose to entrust us with. Now, in short, in the last 2 years especially, we have downsized when we needed to, so that we could upsize God, and we'll continue to do so according to His will. And with all that in mind, I want to thank you for your faithful financial support for the ministries of Ellenwood Oaks Community Church. You see, stewardship isn't about squeezing lemons. It's about trusting God. It's about trusting God. It isn't about counting pennies. It's about counting blessings. So what can we say this morning about the faithful practice of biblical stewardship? To answer that question, we're going to start. We're going to start by answering two important questions. And that first question is, what does the word stewardship mean? The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines the word stewardship simply as the office, duties, and obligations of a steward. So what's a steward? A steward is a manager of a large household or organization. In essence, the root word steward is a job description denoting someone, again, who manages something. Manages, it can be a household or a family, extended family, or a church or a larger organization. And that same word is used in modern contexts. For example, officers of our court systems, elected leaders of labor unions, crew members on cruise ship and airliners, and leadership positions in various other secular organizations such as Masonic lodges. All these people are referred to as stewards. And in more recent years, the term stewardship has expanded to include responsible management of clean water and air, endangered species, and other elements of God's creation. We also hear it commonly used in nonprofit circles through phrases like stewardship fundraising, a promotional program designed to strengthen relationship between nonprofit organizations and their donors. So, now that we have a general idea concerning the secular use of the English word stewardship, let's establish an answer to our second question. What is biblical stewardship? In ancient biblical times, long before planes, trains, and automobiles, when a landowner needed to travel to another village to buy supplies or sell livestock, they might be gone for several days, weeks, or even months. And during his absence, he would appoint one of his servants to act on his behalf to manage his land, manage his household, and the other servants until he returned. Now, that chosen servant was expected to act exactly as the master would. In essence, that's the job description of a steward, a trustworthy, dependable servant managing what belongs to someone else. So if any of you have ever served as a manager in a business, you've already been a steward, managing assets you didn't own as if you did. That brings to mind the morning when the general manager of the manufacturing plant where I worked called me up to his glass-walled office overlooking the plant, and he offered me my first management position. And when I asked him what my new job title would be, he took the offer sheet out of my hand and he filled in the blank space beside job title with the words problem solver. I asked, where should I start? He said, you tell me. Then I asked, well, what exactly am I responsible for if I take this job? He stood up and he walked to the window overlooking the plant and he spread his arms wide and he said, all of it. In the moment when I said yes, I accepted responsibility for the work scheduled for 120 people and the co-management of $6 million worth of material inventory, all of which belonged to somebody else. That, in its simplest form, is stewardship. But biblical stewardship takes that idea and it lifts it towards heaven. It reminds us that everything under our care, from our smallest piggy bank to the greatest calling, belongs to God Himself. And that said, every believer is called to be a steward. So the question isn't whether we are stewards, but rather how faithful we are in that role. With that truth, to help us understand our common calling, I want to turn to 1 Corinthians 4, 1 through 2, where Paul writes, this is how one should regard us as servants, huperetes of Christ, and stewards of the mysteries of God. That's the Greek word, huperetes. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be faithful. So here Paul uses a fascinating word for servants. Not the Greek word doulos, which is the most common Greek word in the New Testament translated as servant or slave. But here he uses a word which literally means under oar. Under oar. Pastor Chris, what's an under oar? Picture the galley of an ancient ship dimly lit with rows of unseen workers rowing in perfect rhythm to the beat of an overseer's drum. Stroke, stroke, stroke. Their position wasn't glamorous. Their names would never be known, but without their steady, unseen faithfulness, the ship went nowhere. That's how Paul viewed himself and his fellow apostles, under rowers and stewards, servants entrusted with God's truth. And what's the one thing Scripture tells us that's required of a steward? Faithfulness. Faithfulness. Not brilliance, not popularity, not success by human standards, just faithfulness. Pastor Chris, what is faithfulness? Faithfulness is the quiet strength that keeps the ship of God's mission moving forward when nobody else is watching. And that brings us to the first of 4 foundational truths I want to look at this morning. Truths that show us what a true faithful steward of God's grace looks like. And that first foundational truth is this: everything belongs to God. Everything belongs to God. As the creator of all created things, God has absolute ownership of all things. In Genesis 1:1, the first 10 words of God's Holy Bible tells us that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That includes every gift, every breath, every opportunity, and every resource we have. It all belongs to Him. As Psalms 24:1 declares, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The world and all its people belong to Him. Therefore, failure to start in Genesis 1:1 at the very beginning of the Bible is like misaligning the top button of our shirt or blouse. Dee Dee has to fix mine all the time. But if we fasten the top button incorrectly, the other buttons, they ain't ever going to line up. Nothing else in God's Word, including the doctrine of biblical stewardship, will make any sense or be relevant to our lives. The bottom line is that if we get this truth wrong, that God created everything and God owns everything, every other principle of stewardship will collapse under the weight of self-ownership. But when we start here, everything else starts to line up. And with that, stewardship defines man's relationship to God. It's stewardship that identifies God as the owner and man as the manager. And then once we're in tune with this essential understanding of the owner-manager relationship between God and man, perhaps the letters written by the Apostle Paul paint the clearest picture of biblical stewardship as he encourages, corrects, and instructs various groups of believers scattered all across the Roman Empire. One such example is found in 1 Corinthians, a letter written by Paul to a group of new believers living in the ancient city of Corinth, located in what is now south-central Greece. Paul had a complicated relationship with this particular group of believers. Upon planting his church, he poured into these guys for 1.5 years, staying with them a whole lot longer than he stayed in most places. And yet many of the Corinthians had a low opinion of Paul. 5 years later, he learned that among other problems, several opposing factions had surfaced within the church, creating great division within the body of Christ. And it boils down to this: these divisions centered on personal loyalties and preferences for a particular teacher, or maybe a flashier teacher, someone who was more imposing than Paul was. This divisiveness not only splintered unity within the body, but it also set believers against the authority of other leaders, including Paul, Apollos, and Peter, men to whom God had given significant responsibility and authority. Consequently, a significant part of Paul's mission in writing the letter to the Corinthians, both letters, was to reestablish unity in the church, starting with some words concerning how one should view all the apostles and teachers that God had placed among them. So with that context, in 1 Corinthians 4, verses 1 through 2, Paul writes, "This is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mystery of God. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. When I held that management position I talked about a few minutes ago, everything under my authority, the people, schedules, the inventory, the equipment, all of these things belonged to the company. They didn't belong to me. And my job was to handle those things faithfully until the one who owned it asked for an account. That's the picture of the Christian life. God is the owner. We are the managers. He provides the resources. We carry the responsibility. And He supplies the blessings while we supply the obedience. And the beauty of all this is that when we faithfully manage what belongs to God, He trusts us with even more. Not because He needs us, but because He delights to work through us. In short, faithful stewardship begins with a humble recognition that says, nothing I have is mine, it's all His. Everything belongs to God. And that's the starting line for every other truth we're going to look at this morning. This brings us to the second of 4 foundational truths that show us what a true faithful steward of God's grace looks like. And that second truth says that while God owns everything, He entrusts some of those things to us. If the first truth declares God's supreme ownership, the second truth celebrates God's trust in us. That same God who spoke galaxies into being and named the stars by number has chosen to place some of His treasures in our hands. Now that thought alone should stop us in our tracks. He owns it all, yet He shares some of those things with us. What a divine mystery of grace that the God who spoke galaxies into being would place creation's treasures in human hands. Psalms 8:4-6. I found this week, and I think it captures this tension perfectly. It says, "What are mere mortals that you should think about them, human beings, that you should care for them? Yet you made them only a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You gave them charge of everything you made, putting all things under their authority." From the beginning, God didn't just create humanity, He commissioned us. He placed Adam and Eve in the garden, not as owners, but as caretakers, stewards of His creation. They were called to cultivate, to guard, to manage, and to multiply. In short, God entrusted His world to human hands. And that pattern continues today. Every gift, every ability, every dollar, every opportunity, every hour of your day is a trust, a deposit from the heart of God. Now, some are entrusted with more, some with less, but all men and women are accountable for what's been given to them. I think Jesus illustrated this so vividly in Matthew chapter 25 in a section called the parable of the talents. A master calls his servants and he entrusts his wealth to them before going on a long journey. And to one he gives 5 talents, that's money, to another 2, to another one, each according to his ability. And I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but when the master returns, he calls each servant to give an account. The message of this parable isn't complicated, it's a little bit sobering. It says that faithfulness isn't measured by how much we've been given, but by how we manage what we've been entrusted with. Now let that sink in. We look around, some of us have been blessed to be in this building for many, many years. But we aren't owners of a church building, creating our own little empire. We're caretakers advancing God's glorious eternal kingdom. And with that, we don't get to choose what we're given and when it might be taken away. But while we hold it, we do get to choose how we use it. And that's why true stewardship is always personal. And it isn't limited to finances. It's how you handle your time, your words, your relationships, your influence, and yes, your checkbook. It's the way you treat the people God places under your care and how you respond to the opportunities that he lays before you. So the faithful steward's question is never, how much can I keep? No, the faithful steward always asks, how can I honor and glorify God with what I've been given? And like the servants in the parable of the talents, our master will hold us accountable. Romans 14:12 says it plainly. It says, yes, each of us will give a personal account to God. Now that isn't a threat. That's just a sacred reminder. God has trusted you and I with time that we can't reclaim, and with gifts that we didn't earn, and with people whose lives you influence more than you realize. So here's the heartbeat of the second truth. Faithful stewardship is our grateful response to divine trust. And when we remember that what's in our hands came from his heart, we stop clutching it, and instead we start cultivating it. We start growing it. And that brings us to our third foundational truth that shows us what a true faithful steward of God's grace looks like. And that truth says we are responsible for managing God's entrusted resources wisely on his behalf. If the first truth teaches us divine ownership and the second teaches us trust, this third truth teaches us responsibility. God has placed his resources in our hands, but not for our convenience, but for his cause and glory. Therefore, he isn't impressed with how much we possess, but by how wisely we manage what he's placed under our care. Now, everybody here, every human manages something. A home, an ability to keep a job or manage a company, or maybe you've even owned your own business. But again, everyone manages something, and with that, it's wise to always be ready to give an account. What do you mean, Pastor Chris? Be ready to give an account to whom? Well, I can answer that question with two words. Income taxes. The tax man. That's the moment that every steward dreads, the audit. Every pastor knows the moment when a church member asks, where did all the money go? Every parent knows that moment when their teenager comes in the room and says, you said I could borrow the car. Every breadwinner knows what it's like to tell their unsuspecting spouse that they can't pay the power bill this month. And every believer should know that one day the Lord will call us to give an account. Again, Romans 14:12 leaves no room for misunderstanding. Again, it says, yes, each of us will give a personal account to God. Now again, that isn't meant to strike fear. It's meant to stir faith. The God who holds us accountable is the same God who gives us grace for the journey and grace when we mess up. So it ain't about numbers. It's about narratives, because God is much more interested in my story than he is my spreadsheets. So accountability, it isn't what you spent, it's what you sought. It isn't how much you saved up, it's what you served. It isn't how much you had in this life, it's about who you honored. That said, faithful stewardship is about alignment, living in such a way that every decision says, this belongs to God, and I want to please him with the way I use it. With that, whether we're managing money, time, influence, or opportunities, wisdom means asking, does this reflect the heart and will of my master? Does this investment that I made, this purchase, this conversation, this choice, glorify the one who owns all of it? Proverbs 3:9-10 says this, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the best part of everything you produce. Then he will fill your barns with grain, and your vats will overflow with good wine. Now notice that the promise follows the principle. Honor first, overflow later. God doesn't bless reckless hands, but he's delighted to fill the cups of the faithful. Wise stewardship also means understanding seasons. Take Joseph. Joseph didn't just interpret Pharaoh's dream, he implemented God's plan. He stored up grain in years of plenty so that when famine came, God's people wouldn't perish. Now, friends, that's wisdom in motion. That's foresight guided by faith. Now, we may not all manage storehouses or Fortune 500 companies, but we do manage decisions that affect our families, that affect our church, and the kingdom work that goes on around us. And when we give, and when we plan, and when we repair, and when we save, we're writing our part of God's story of provision. So the call here is simple, but it's also sacred. And that call says, manage wisely, live deliberately, and give generously. Because when we do, the testimony of our life song will sing, He trusted me, and by His grace I did my best to be found faithful. And when that day comes when the final account is settled, may we hear the words that every faithful steward longs to hear. Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. And that brings us to our fourth and final foundational truth that shows us what a true faithful steward of God's grace looks like. And that truth says, faithful stewardship leads to present joy and eternal reward. The beauty of God's holy economy is that nothing offered in faith is ever wasted. Every act of obedience, every moment of sacrifice, every hidden work done for His glory will one day echo in eternity. In Luke 16:10 through 12, Jesus says this. He says, if you're faithful in little things, you will be faithful in large ones. But if you are dishonest in little things, you won't be honest with greater responsibilities. And if you're trustworthy about worldly wealth, who will trust you with the true riches of heaven? Did y'all catch that phrase that I highlighted, your true riches? True riches aren't measured in dollars or square feet or luxury cars. No, they're measured in souls touched, in lives changed, and faith that's grown to completion. Now, the world says hold on tightly, but the gospel says let go joyfully. Why? Because when we release what's in our hands, God releases what He holds in His hands. I've seen it time and time again. I've seen it in our widows who give from a fixed income with a smile, in couples who quietly fund a ministry or a benevolent need. I've seen it in members who will show up if asked early to make coffee or to prepare to teach a class or greet visitors who may never come. All those things are acts of faithful stewardship, and heaven keeps up with the receipts. That said, faithful stewardship isn't about guilt, it's about gratitude. It's the sound of a heart that says, Lord, you've been too good to me for me to hold anything back. And friends, that's the coal that keeps my steam engine running down the track these days. And one day when the ledgers of this life are closed and the final audit is complete, the only account that will matter to us is the one that reads, faithful. In that moment, our reward won't be trophies or titles. It will be in seeing the face of the one who trusted us, hearing Him say, well done, and realizing that everything we gave was really just giving back what He gave us first. So, here's a closing question to think about this week. What resources has God placed in your hands? Now, maybe it ain't all, maybe it ain't worth all that much according to worldly standards. A tiny apartment, a mobile home, a limited income, a handful of people around who might look to you for guidance. But in the hands of a faithful steward, little becomes much when God's in it. Think about it. When Jesus fed the 5,000, he started with one boy's lunch. He didn't need the bread or the fish, but he used them. Why? Because a little kid was willing to offer what he had. And that's the call of stewardship, not to give until it hurts, but to trust until it heals. To hold our blessings loosely so that God can use them freely. So again, whether you're managing a business, a budget, or a broken heart, offer it to Him. Why? Because when the owner of all creation entrusts something to you, He's saying, I believe you can be faithful with this. And by His grace, church, I know you can be. So as we leave this place to begin another glorious week of many to come, try to remember these 4 truths. Everything belongs to God. He trusts some of those things to us. We are responsible for managing God's entrusted resources wisely on His behalf. And when we live by these truths, faithful stewardship becomes worship. Our giving becomes grace, and our service becomes eternal joy. So with that, let us go out of here this week and live and give and serve in such a way that our lives declare one simple truth. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, including me. With that, y'all remember to connect, equip, serve, and encourage one another, and we will see you guys next time.